The 9,221st meeting of the Security Council is called to order. Before we begin the meeting today, I invite all members to join me in observing a minute of silence in honor of all the victims of terrorism. We have also received reports of the tragic killing of an Irish peacekeeper and injuries to 4 others in Lebanon yesterday. We pray for the speedy recovery. I would invite all members to honor the peacekeepers who have laid down their lives over the years in the course of their duties. Please stand for a minute of silence. Please. The provisional agenda for this meeting is threats to international peace and security caused by terrorist acts, global counterterrorism approach, principles, and the way forward. The agenda is adopted. I would like to warmly welcome the distinguished ministers and other high-level representatives. Your presence today underscores the importance of the subject matter under discussion. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the following briefers to participate in the meeting: Mr. Vladimir Voronkov, Under-Secretary General, United Nations Office of Counterterrorism; Mr. Wei Xiong Chen, Acting Executive Director of the Counterterrorism Executive Directorate; and Ms. Anjali Vijay Kulthe, Nursing Officer at the Kama and Albliss Hospital in Mumbai, a survivor of the 26/11 Mumbai terror attacks. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda. I wish to draw the attention of Council members to document S/2022/906, a letter dated 5 December 2022 from the Permanent Representative of India to the United Nations, addressed to the Secretary General, transmitting a concept paper on the item under consideration. I now give the floor to Mr. Vladimir Voronkov.
Mr. President, Excellencies, I thank the Republic of India for organizing this briefing during its presidency of the Security Council. The persistent global threat posed by terrorism not only requires this Council's continued attention, but also calls for a renewed collective approach, as laid out in the Secretary General's report on our common agenda. His new agenda for peace will outline a way forward to address converging risks and threats that include not only terrorism, but also armed conflict, a worsening climate emergency, poverty and inequality, the unregulated cyberspace, and not easy recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic. The magnitude and the complexity of today's threats to international peace and security require no less. And in this regard, I reiterate the Secretary General's call for strengthening multilateralism as a matter of necessity, not of choice. Mr. President, Excellencies, despite continuing leadership losses by Al-Qaeda and Daesh, terrorism in general has become more prevalent and more geographically widespread, affecting the lives of millions worldwide. In recent years, terrorist groups such as Daesh, Al-Qaeda, and their affiliates have continued to exploit instability, fragility, and conflict to advance their agendas. This has been the case particularly in the West Africa and the Sahel, where the situation remains urgent as terrorist groups strive to expand their area of operations. The activities of such groups have also contributed to the deteriorating of security situation in other parts of the continent, particularly in Central and Southern Africa. In Afghanistan, the sustained presence of terrorist groups continues to pose serious threats to the region and beyond, as some groups maintain ambitions to conduct external operations. Moreover, it's concerning that the de facto authorities have failed to sever long-standing ties with terrorist groups sheltering in the country, despite this council demands that they do so. Terrorist groups in this and in the other contexts often pursue diverse agendas through different strategies, adapting opportunistically. They do so in part by resorting to illicit financing methods and other criminal activities, posing difficult challenges for coordinated responses by members. Others morph into or grafted themselves onto insurgencies that occupy territory and purport to assume state responsibilities. The manner in which these groups misuse and abuse developments and technological innovation to advance their agendas is also concerning. This includes the use of online video games and the adjacent platform to groom and recruit members, propagandize, communicate, and even train for terrorist acts. In this regard, I welcome the adoption by consensus of the Delhi Declaration at the special meeting of the Counter-Terrorism Committee held by India in October. The Office of Counter-Terrorism will continue to work closely with other United Nations entities, including CITED, to ensure that the misuse of new and emerging technologies by terrorists is addressed as a cross-cutting priority. I am also concerned about a rise in terrorist attacks based on xenophobia, racism, and other forms of intolerance, or in the name of religion or belief. While not a new phenomenon, a few member states consider this is the fastest growing or even the most prominent domestic security threat that they face. I underline the Secretary General's view that this phenomenon requires further understanding and reiterate this call to the development and implementation of national to address this threat. Mr. President, allow me to outline some suggested principles for guiding our collective action in countering terrorism going forward. First, preventive action. There is no better and more efficient remedy to the threat posed by terrorism than prevention. The international counterterrorism experience over the past 20 years demonstrates the limits of focusing on the necessity of security forces responding to imminent or actual terrorist acts without also addressing the conditions that lead to terrorist acts. Counterterrorism measures should be employed in tandem with initiatives to address the drivers of marginalization, exclusion, inequality, injustice, and lack of opportunity. The same sorts of issues needed to reinforce the social contract between citizens and their governments. Second, addressing the complex conditions driving terrorism requires multifaceted and integrated responses. Whole of society approaches should be community-based, conflict and gender sensitive. Engaging a multitude of stakeholders is indispensable for devising such strategies. This includes not only civil society organizations, religious leaders, youth and women's groups in the private sector, but also victims and survivors of terrorist acts. Third, in keeping with the United Nations Global Counterterrorist Strategy, human rights must be at the center of effective counterterrorism responses. Upholding the rule of law and respecting international law, including human rights law, is both a legal and moral obligation and an operational requirement. Well-established principles, norms, and standards should feature front and center in our efforts to counter the threat posed by terrorist acts. Finally, regional arrangements should be leveraged. As the threat posed by terrorism is transnational, so too should be the responses. Regional-based approaches offer an opportunity for tailoring responses to specific contexts. It is for this reason that the Office of Counterterrorism is co-organizing with Nigeria a summit on counterterrorism in Africa. This summit presents an important opportunity to reconsider how the United Nations could further support counterterrorism efforts in Africa. I look forward to working closely with this Council as we strive to revitalize our multilateral action to counter and prevent terrorist acts. I thank you for your attention.
I thank Mr. Varanko for his briefing. I now give the floor to Mr. Wei Xiongchen.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, the terrorist landscape continues to evolve. Terrorist groups such as Daesh, Al-Qaeda, and their affiliates continue to recalibrate their strategic and operational methods. With those groups and cells becoming more locally based and decentralized, the threat has become diffuse and diverse in nature. Away from their traditional theaters, battlefields have emerged in the Sahel, West, East, Southern, and Central Africa, as well as in parts of Asia. Meanwhile, Daesh persists in its attempts to regroup in its traditional geographic center. We're also seeing an increase in threats from terrorism on the basis of xenophobia, racism, and other forms of intolerance. Those groups have become more transnational in nature. They have forged strong links across borders and built robust networks, exploiting virtual platforms where they exchange views, radicalize others into terrorism, recruit, and support one another financially and operationally. Against this backdrop, criminal justice actors have a critical role to play in addressing those threats in a meaningful manner. Mr. President, terrorists continue to exploit online platforms, including gaming platforms, to recruit and radicalize, raise funds, plan and coordinate operations, and disseminate propaganda. Against this backdrop, the Counterterrorism Committee held a special meeting on countering the use of new and emergent technologies for terrorist purposes in India, October the 29th and 28th, 2022. The Counterterrorism Committee Executive Directorate was able to provide its full support in organizing this special meeting, which saw the participation of key stakeholders, including member states, United Nations agencies, international and regional organizations, civil society organizations, the private sector, and members of CTED's Global Research Network. The special meeting focused on three key areas: the Internet, including social media platforms and related online spaces, countering terrorism financing and new payment technologies, and misuse of unmanned aerial systems. The special meeting brought to the forefront overarching considerations of a one UN approach, upholding human rights, the role of civil society, and honoring the victims of terrorism. The committee adopted the Delhi Declaration to reaffirm its commitment to working with member states in achieving full implementation of all relevant Security Council resolutions to address the threats posed by terrorism. CTED will support the Counterterrorism Committee in the development of a set of non-binding guiding principles that are consistent with international human rights law and humanitarian law to assist member states in countering the threat posed by the use of new and emergent technologies for terrorist purposes. To achieve our goals, we must work in an inclusive fashion, involving a broad range of stakeholders and partners. The UN counterterrorism architecture has also provided a useful platform for CTED to collaborate with the United Nations Office of Counterterrorism and other entities of the Global Compact to work together towards our common objective. We also look forward to further collaborating with member states, international regional organizations, civil society, the private sector, and other stakeholders in such endeavors. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank Mr. Chen for his briefing. I now give the floor to Ms. Anjali Vijay Kulte.
Namaste,
Honorable Chair, Excellencies, Namaste to all of you. I am Anjali Vijay Kulte from Mumbai, India. I am a staff nurse at the Kama and Albles Hospital in Mumbai. This is one of the earliest hospitals in India, established exclusively for women and children in 1886 with support from private donors. I have been working at this hospital for the last 22 years. I am one of the fortunate ones who survived the terrorist attack on the hospital on the night of 26 November 2008. As a victim and survivor of terrorism, I bring to this Council's notice the voice of trauma and sorrow endured by families of victims and survivors of terrorist attacks from across the world. On 26 November 2008, I had a night shift in the antenatal care unit from 8 p.m. 20 pregnant women were under my charge that night. I had two helpers, Hira and Madhu, assisting me. An hour later, we were informed that the city's main railway station, around a mile away from the hospital, has been stormed by terrorists. Our senior officials called and asked us to prepare for an emergency. While we began preparing, we heard gunshots being fired at around 10:30 p.m. from behind the hospital. I and my helpers quickly moved to the window of my ward's bathroom. We noticed that two persons with guns entered the hospital after jumping over the wall. One of them fired at our window. We closely escaped the bullet, which hit one of my helpers' thumb and the lights of the ward. Hira's thumb was profusely bleeding, and the room became dark. I escorted her to the accident ward on the ground floor for the treatment. I also informed the chief medical officer of the hospital that terrorists have entered our hospital and are firing. As I rushed towards the ward on first floor, I saw the same two terrorists shooting the two security guards of the hospital. Both the security guards fell on the floor with their bodies heavily bleeding. I was extremely scared. I gathered courage and rushed to the first floor. I closed the main iron door and shifted all the patients to the pantry with the help of another staff. I locked the door and switched off the lights so that the shooters could not see the patients. At all costs, I wanted to protect my patients from firing by terrorists. While I was locking the door, I saw two terrorists rushing towards the second floor and being chased by some policemen. We heard firing continuously. We experienced heavy shocks because of explosion of grenades. While we were hiding in the ward, I thought to myself, death is inevitable in this life. Why not die valiantly? I consoled my petrified patients who were in advanced stages of pregnancy. I feared that some of my patients would go into labor due to fear induced high blood pressure. Such a condition could be extremely serious for both the mother and baby's life. And my fear came alive. Suddenly, a patient shrieked that she was going into labor. My medical officer could not come down from second floor. I felt helpless. I didn't know what to do next. Suddenly, I felt my uniform gave me the courage, and my passion for nursing gave me clarity of thought. I escorted my patient to the pregnancy ward, but she was scared and reluctant to come with me to the ward. I assured her and requested her to follow me. While we were climbing the staircase, we heard heavy gun firing and hand grenade explosions. With faith, I managed to get my patient to the labor room. A while later, we were able to midwife a healthy baby. Then I returned to my ward to check on my other 19 patients. We spent the whole night in complete darkness with patients locked up in rooms. We opened the doors next day morning as the police arrived. it was hard to believe that we were alive. I could not sleep peacefully for several nights and woke up many times in middle of many nights with vivid memories of the terrorist attacks. I shiver even today as I recall the night of terrorist attacks. While the terrorists were killing human beings like insects, I am happy that I was able to save lives of 20 pregnant women and their unborn babies. Although the terror and horror of that night is still alive with me, I soothe myself by thinking of the several lives I and my colleagues in the hospital saved. One month after this terrorist attack, I was summoned by authorities to identify the lone surviving terrorist, Ajmal Kasab, of these attacks. Although my family feared reprisals for testifying in the court, I chose to be the witness. In the jail, when I recognized him, he smiled sarcastically and said, "Madam, you recognized me correctly. I am Ajmal Kasab." Kasab did not have an iota of remorse, no shame, no guilt. His sense of victory haunts me even today. Whenever I see news reports on television about terrorist attacks anywhere in the world, my heart goes out for the victims and survivors of such attacks who live rest of their lives in trauma. We, the victims of 26/11 Mumbai attacks, continue to wait for justice, as the sponsors of these dastardly attacks remain free even after 14 years. Too many lives have been lost, too many children have been orphaned, too many people have been traumatized. I request the international community through this council to bring the sponsors of 26/11 Mumbai attacks to justice and give the families of victims a closure. Thank you.
I thank Ms. Kulte for her briefing. I will now make a statement in my capacity as the External Affairs Minister of India. Excellencies, at the outset, I acknowledge the presence of the Honourable Ministers of Ireland, UAE, the UK, USA, Kenya, and Ghana, and all high-level representatives. I thank you all for accepting my invitation to participate in today's briefing. I would also like to thank Ambassador Vladimir Voronkov, the Undersecretary General for Counterterrorism, and Acting Executive Director Wei Xiong Chen for their briefings to the Security Council today. We value the work of the UNOCT in leading the UN efforts to assist member states by providing them necessary capacity building through its various global programs. I also thank Nurse Anjali Kulte, a valiant victim of the 26/11 terror attacks, from whom you've heard just now, who has vividly shared with us her recollection of the human costs of terrorism. Her testimony is a stark reminder to the Council and the international community that justice is yet to be delivered to the victims of several terrorist incidents, including the 26/11 Mumbai attack. This Council is well aware that terrorism is an existential threat to international peace and security. It knows no borders, nationality, or race, and is a challenge that the international community must combat collectively. India faced the horrors of cross-border terrorism long before the world took serious note of it. Over the decades, we lost thousands of innocent civilian lives, but we fought terrorism resolutely, bravely, and with a zero-tolerance approach. As Prime Minister Narendra Modi has declared, we consider that even a single attack is one too many, and even a single life lost is one too many. So we will not rest till terrorism is uprooted. Today's briefing is part of India's ongoing efforts in the Security Council to reinvigorate the counter-terrorism agenda. And that is overdue because the threat of terrorism has actually become even more serious. We have seen the expansion of Al-Qaeda, Daesh, Boko Haram, and Al-Shabaab and their affiliates. At the other end of the spectrum are lone wolf attacks inspired by online radicalization and biases. But somewhere in all of this, we cannot forget that old habits and established networks are still alive, especially in South Asia. The contemporary epicenter of terrorism remains very much active, whatever gloss may be applied to minimize unpleasant realities. On this occasion, let me therefore highlight 4 specific challenges with which the counter-terrorism architecture is currently grappling. 1. The issue of terror financing and state culpability, whether by commission or omission. The world may no longer be willing to buy the justifications and cover-ups as in the past. Through bitter experience, we know that terror is terror, whatever the explanation. The question now arises as to the responsibilities of the state from whose soil such actions are planned, supported, and perpetrated. 2. Ensuring the integrity and accountability of the counter-terror multilateral mechanisms and their working methods. They are on occasion opaque, sometimes driven by agendas, and at times even pushed without evidence. 3. Addressing double standards in countering terrorism, leading to concerns of politicization. Uniform criteria are not applied to sanctioning and prosecuting terrorists. It would seem sometimes that the ownership of terrorism is more important than its actual perpetration or its consequences. And 4. Countering threats from the misuse of new and emerging technologies by terrorists. This is likely to be the next frontier of our battle. Let me dilate on each of these aspects briefly. By now, it is well established where and how terrorist organizations operate and under what kind of protection. Activities like recruitment, financing, and motivation are often done in the open. The days when it could be said that we were unaware are now behind us. Consequently, assigning responsibility is that much easier. The response of the sponsors of terrorism is not to give up, but to conduct and execute their agenda at an arm's length. To do this, they create narratives of limitations and difficulties. We buy such explanations at our own peril. The suggestion that states who are apparently capable on everything else but are only helpless when it comes to terrorism is ludicrous. Accountability must therefore be the bedrock of counterterrorism. The working methods of relevant mechanisms is also a subject of legitimate concern and debate. At one level, we have seen protections that come close to justification. Then there are evidence-backed proposals that are put on hold without assigning adequate reason. Conversely, there have even been recourse to anonymity so as to avoid taking ownership of untenable cases. The third challenge is how do we deal with differential standards both inside and outside the Council. For too long, some have persisted with the belief that terrorism is just another instrument or stratagem. Those invested in terrorism have used such cynicism to carry on. It is not just plain wrong, but could be downright dangerous, even for the very people whose toleration extends this far. The fourth challenge is the growing potential for the misuse of new and emerging technologies by extremists, radicals, and terrorists. Over the years, they have diversified their funding portfolio and expanded the recruitment toolkit. They exploit the anonymity afforded by new and emerging technologies such as virtual currencies for fundraising and finances. Terrorist groups are taking advantage of the openness of democratic societies spreading false narratives, inciting hatred, and radicalizing ideologies. Taking all these into account, we need to adopt a comprehensive, contemporary, and result-oriented approach to this set of challenges. No individual state should endeavor to seek political gain from terrorism, and none of us, collectively, should ever put up with such calculations. When it comes to tackling terrorism, we must overcome political differences and manifest a zero-tolerance approach. When we began our current term in the Council last January, I had proposed an 8-point action plan on counter-terrorism to this very Council. I'm glad that some of the action points have found reflection in the presidential statement to be adopted by the Council at the end of this meeting. As the chair of the Counter-Terrorism Committee of the Security Council this year, India has striven to bring these principles into the counter-terrorism architecture of the UN and into the debate on terrorism at this Council. We were privileged to host you all in Mumbai and Delhi during the special meeting of the Counter-Terrorism Committee in end October. The Delhi Declaration that was adopted then is a landmark document, and with it, we hope that this Council will build on this further. Let me conclude by emphasizing that we cannot let another 9/11 of New York or 26/11 of Mumbai happen again. In the last 2 decades, terrorism has been significantly countered and its justification delegitimized. But this remains work in progress. Combating terrorism is a battle in which there is no respite. The world cannot afford attention deficits or tactical compromises. It is most of all for the Security Council to lead the global response in this regard. Today's briefing is another step in that direction. I thank you, and I now resume my duties as chair. I now give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Simon Coveney, Minister for Foreign Affairs and Minister of Defence of Ireland.
Thank you very much, President. May I also thank our 3 guests today who have given very thought-provoking and emotive briefings to us today. I also want to commend India for its focus on the important issue of counter-terrorism throughout its Council's tenure, and congratulate you on your successes. I want to start my contribution by expressing my deep sadness at the death of an Irish peacekeeper and injuries to 3 others in an incident in Lebanon yesterday. And I want to thank the Indian Presidency for the respect that they've shown by offering a minute's silence at the start of this meeting. These soldiers were serving proudly as part of the 121st Infantry Battalion in UNIFIL. The incident and loss of life is a stark reminder that our peacekeepers serve in dangerous circumstances. They put themselves in harm's way. All times, though, in the cause of peace. They operate under mandates that we decide here in this chamber to ensure that they can do the work they need to do, but also to ensure that they operate as safely as possible in terms of our obligation to manage risk. I want to offer my deepest condolences to the family and loved ones of the young soldier who died, and also to the loved ones of all peacekeepers who have died in the course of their duty, too many this year. President, when I first addressed this Council after Ireland joined almost 2 years ago, I stated clearly that terrorism remains one of the gravest threats to international peace and security. Over the past 2 years, we have witnessed that threat evolve and unfortunately spread in the Sahel, in Afghanistan with the sheltering of Al-Qaeda and other terrorist groups under Taliban rule, in Iraq and Syria with a continuing threat. As Ireland prepares to leave the Council, I welcome the opportunity to reflect on how our counter-terrorism efforts can be more impactful. President, the most effective way to counter terrorism is to prevent it in the first place. Tackling the global terrorist threat means addressing its complex and varied drivers. We know that communities affected by conflict, poverty, inequality, poor governance, and human rights violations are more vulnerable to radicalization and recruitment. Unless we address the root causes, we resign ourselves to addressing the same security challenges over and over again. Respect for human rights and the rule of law are vital in preventing the growth of radicalization and extremism, and they are both critical components of effective counterterrorism responses. Often, too often, measures adopted by states to counter terrorism have been misused to repress human rights and freedoms. In October, together with the UN Special Rapporteur, Fionnuala Ní Aoláin, Ireland hosted an event highlighting the ways in which counter-terrorist financing measures are sometimes misused to target civil society, humanitarian actors, and human rights defenders. These actions serve only to drive radicalization and reinforce terrorist narratives. We must also heed the calls of our African partners, who have consistently advised us on the ways that climate change can aggravate the root causes of terrorism itself. Most UN member states, including the large majority on this Council, recognise the clear link between climate change and instability. It is staring us in the face. And it's high time that this Council acted on the facts. We know that there is a wealth of experience and analysis that civil society partners can provide on the issues of counter-terrorism. Yet the avenues for civil society to engage with the Council's counter-terrorism architecture are too limited. Dealing effectively with these issues, particularly the use of new and emerging technologies for terrorist purposes, requires a much more serious partnership with civil society. In addition, the full, equal and meaningful participation of women in counter-terrorism processes is also critical. Empowering women, ensuring that they are at the counter-terrorism table, fundamentally disrupts the status quo for the better. President, UN sanctions are one of the critical instruments employed by this Council to hold terrorists to account and to target them. But to have the desired effect, sanctions must be targeted and they must be effective in the areas where we need them to be. During our term on the Council, one of the recurring messages we heard from civil society and humanitarian partners was about the inadvertently negative impact of sanctions measures on the delivery of humanitarian assistance. We listened carefully to this message, and we responded collectively as a Council. Alongside the US, we were proud to secure agreement last Friday on Resolution 2664. This landmark initiative, providing humanitarian exemptions across all UN sanctions regimes, will help to ensure that aid reaches all populations at risk, particularly in areas where terrorists are active. At a time of unprecedented global challenges, I am heartened that this Council took decisive action and provided a humanitarian lifeline to those experiencing conflict and terrorism. To conclude, if I may, let me offer some short reflections on our 2-year term on this Council. Just last week, we marked the 100th anniversary of the Irish Free State. One of its first actions was to seek membership of the then League of Nations. 100 years on, Ireland is steadfast in our commitment to multilateralism. To sit at this table, elected by the members of the General Assembly, is a great privilege. Those of us lucky enough to do so should be frank enough to admit that multilateralism is struggling today. We need reform. We need creative, responsive solutions to global challenges that could not even have been imagined by the drafters of the UN Charter. But most of all, we need political will. As our Prime Minister said in his speech during the high-level week this year, we have in this Council, in the General Assembly, and in other bodies, institutions and agencies that make up the United Nations, the space to discuss, to negotiate, to share experiences, and to craft solutions. We have an interlocking web of charters, of treaties, of norms, of resolutions, of international jurisprudence, of political declarations, and of agreed statements and conclusions. Our global structures are not perfect, we know that. No structures ever are in reality. But it is not our systems or our structures, nor our treaties or our charters that are fundamentally failing us today. It is the lack of political will to implement and uphold them that is the root cause of our failures in this Council. Reform is essential, particularly reform of the veto, the use of which is self-defeating, the use of which, in my view, has no place in a 21st century Security Council. But reform alone will not make multilateralism work. That responsibility rests with us, the Member States together. Member States will continue to have differing perspectives on many issues on this Council agenda. But they must, we must, you must, find a way to work in genuine partnership and good faith so that the Council can act with the ambition and determination that is so urgently required. Too often, we see narrow self-interest taking precedence. We see Council members blocking crucial decisions to protect themselves and/or their allies. President, Council members, whether permanent or elected, have reached this table in different ways. But once we are here in this chamber, surely we have a shared responsibility to defend international peace and security, and the hundreds of millions of vulnerable people who rely on us to do that. We must do better to live up to that responsibility. Thank you, President.
I thank His Excellency, Mr. Coveney, for his statement. I now give the floor to Her Excellency, Ms. Noura bint Mohammed Al-Kabi, Cabinet Member and Minister of Culture and Youth of the United Arab Emirates.
السيد الرئيس.
Mr. President, I would like in the beginning to join my colleagues in expressing our sincere condolences, Your Excellency Simon Coveney, and the family of the Irish peacekeeper who was killed today by a callous attack while on duty in southern Lebanon. We wish a speedy recovery to all those injured. Mr. President, I thank the Republic of India for organizing this important discussion on the international community's approach to combating terrorism. I would also like to thank Undersecretary General Mr. Voronkov and the Acting Executive Director Mr. Chen for their valuable briefings. I have also listened attentively to the moving briefing by Ms. Anjali Vijay Kulte. Mr. President, over the past 2 decades and through this organization, we have enacted many policies and measures to address the terrorist threat. Most notably, this includes the historic adoption of Security Council Resolution 1373, which responds to one of the greatest challenges of this era that undermines stability as well as prosperity. And despite the significant efforts by the international community, international terrorist threats continue to evolve. The scope of such threats have become more widespread and tactics have grown more complex. Terrorist groups continue to exploit natural resources to finance their operations and use modern technology to launch cross-border terrorist attacks. They have also used the vacuum of authority to distort international attention because of the competing crises in the world. Mr. President, We have made great strides towards strengthening international cooperation and building capacities and developing strategies as means to combat terrorism. However, we realize there is still a long way to go to eradicate terrorism. Therefore, we must maintain international momentum and vigilant in identifying shortcomings and preventing the exploitation of gaps. We must also be more flexible to keep pace with the evolving methods of terrorists and must be proactive in our prevention of extremism and terrorism. These concerns point to the importance of our discussion today. I would like to highlight three main aspects that we should focus on. First, the geographical scope of terrorist activities is expanding. The African continent has not been spared like others from the repercussions of this scourge. Nearly half of the victims of terrorism in the world are in Africa, where terrorist groups seek refuge in search of shelter and breeding ground. Therefore, it is no longer enough for the Council to focus on certain terrorist groups to the exclusion of others, especially considering the transnational nature of terrorist threats. Thus, it is imperative to harness all tools available to the Council, including sanctions committees, to curb terrorist activity. Additionally, regional and local efforts must be supported, and coordination with actors, including women and youth, must be intensified. Second, terrorists use sophisticated means and methods. Terrorist groups have proven their ability to exploit technological advances, including drones and digital currencies. Accordingly, the Delhi Declaration on combating the use of new and emerging technologies for terrorist purposes represents an important step upon which we look forward to bridging gaps and developing solid regulatory frameworks for the participation of governments and the private sector at the local and global level. Third, terrorism in all its forms must be addressed through comprehensive and multilateral strategies that focus on prevention. We will not be able to eradicate terrorism without exposing extremist ideologies that fuel violence and hatred, as well as incite killing and destruction. Therefore, we must insulate our societies from extremism and address its root causes. The UAE has therefore committed to work through a comprehensive framework to counter extremism. This includes rejecting all attempts to distort and exploit Islam by raising awareness that tolerance, peaceful coexistence, and celebrating diversity are inherent values in Islamic culture. The UAE's public and private institutions have launched several initiatives in cooperation with regional and international partners to eliminate extremism in a sustainable manner. One clear example is the Human Fraternity Conference, hosted by the United Arab Emirates. The conference resulted in the signing of the Human Fraternity Document for World Peace and Coexistence by Pope Francis and Grand Imam Sheikh Al-Azhar Sharif Ahmed At-Tayyib to catalyze dialogue on coexistence and brotherhood among people, and to promote these values globally. The 14th of February became the International Day of Human Fraternity, and it represents an annual opportunity to promote the diversity of cultures. The Forum of Religions of the Group of 20, which the UAE is hosting this week, demonstrates the country's vision to create a community of tolerance in the world and peaceful existence and diversity by presenting recommendations of approximately 100 leaders of various religious communities to the leaders of the New Delhi Summit in 2023. In conclusion, Mr. President, the presidential statement that we are adopting today confirms that terrorism remains at the top of the Council's priorities. As chairman of the Counterterrorism Committee next year, the UAE will build on the achievements made during the Indian presidency this month, and we will cooperate with our colleagues to enhance our capacity for implementation and face the global threat, and for all our societies, wherever they may be, to enjoy stability, prosperity, and security. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank Her Excellency, Ms. Al-Kabi, for her statement. I now give the floor to Her Excellency, Ms. Victoria Nuland, Undersecretary for Political Affairs of the United States of America.
Thank you, Chairman. First, Minister Coveney, our hearts are with you, the Irish people, the family of your fallen peacekeeper, and with those who are recovering from the vicious attack in Lebanon. Further evidence of the risks that all of our peacekeepers take in support of the missions of this body. I also want to thank Dr. Jaishankar, Permanent Representative Cambodge, and India for this vital session, for your presidency of the Council this month, and for your active engagement and leadership as chair of the Counterterrorism Committee this year. The U.S. Counterterrorism Coordinator was just in New Delhi this week, working on ways to deepen our own partnership further, including against new and emerging threats. I also want to thank our UN briefers, especially Mrs. Anjali, for reminding us that the numbers on terrorism don't show the true story of the pain and the human toll. Mrs. Anjali's story is painful not because it is unique, but because it is not. Last year, the world faced more than 8,000 terrorist incidents across 65 countries, killing more than 23,000 people. Stories like Mrs. Anjali's of families and communities left shattered, stories of unbelievable horror and desperation, but also of heroism like hers. Other recent attacks around the world, the bombing of a police station in Indonesia, the coup attempt in Germany, and hateful incidents here in our own country, remind us that no country is safe from this threat, and it cannot be defeated by any of us alone or by any regional bloc. We must all work together. It's incumbent upon us to tackle these issues jointly, from the under and ungoverned spaces susceptible to terrorist control, to the desperate conditions that are conducive to recruitment, to the sources of illicit finance, and to the perverse ideologies spreading online and across borders. The UN now estimates that racially or ethnically motivated violent extremism, what we call REMV, has increased over 320% in recent years, with worrying new transatlantic links among groups. This ideology, rooted in hate, xenophobia, racism, anti-Semitism, and all forms of bigotry, has found common cause online, with new members being recruited through various social media platforms, and fake and manipulated photos quickly spreading misinformation and hate. It's therefore critical that we build on our shared capabilities in order to better detect, degrade, and respond to these new threats. That's why we are working with partners now to strengthen domestic law enforcement, judicial capabilities, border security, improve intelligence and information sharing on these threats, and sever key sources of terrorist financing. In May, we launched the Counterterrorism Law Enforcement Forum in Berlin, bringing together law enforcement officials from some 40 countries to build capacity and share best practices. In Indonesia, for example, the United States supports continuous mentorship programs to vetted law enforcement agencies investigating terrorist activity. In Kenya, we work with security and law enforcement to enhance detection and prevention and improve investigations, prosecutions, and ensure we get convictions. And here in September, during the UN General Assembly, at the Global Counterterrorism Forum, I announced a new racially and ethically motivated violent extremism counter toolkit developed jointly by the United States and Norway to provide practical recommendations for countries and communities to recognize and respond to this threat. But while we work on REMV, we also have to not distract from the parallel fight against al-Qaeda and ISIS wherever it is found. Despite our success of the global coalition to defeat ISIS and the decisive strike against al-Qaeda leader Ayman al-Zawahiri in July, the threat is significant. One way the Council can help is by doing more on the current sanctions list to ensure it accurately reflects realities on the ground. UN sanctions are an essential tool in our counterterrorism toolkit. The Council should support listing all ISIS and al-Qaeda affiliates as well as their leaders and key supporters so that they face global asset freezes, travel bans, and arms embargoes. Unfortunately, the 1267 and 751 committees have only agreed to designate one entity and one individual this year. An array of holds due to unrelated political fights stand in the way of new listings. This political obstructionism fundamentally undermines the committee's mandate to prevent and deter threats to international peace and security and weakens the impact of the UN sanctions regime. We've been pleased to co-nominate several listings with India on ISIS and al-Qaeda, and we hope that the 1267 committee will move forward with these and other new nominations. The Council took strong steps last week to adopt Resolution 2664 to help ensure that reputable, impartial humanitarian actors are able to do their life-saving work even in areas where terrorists operate or control territory. This is going to ensure that those in need get the help they need and that they're not left simply at the mercy of the terrorists. We simply can't afford to leave these civilians exposed to the predations of malign actors who fail to meet their basic needs and often steal from them and destroy their property and take their lives. We are very grateful for the efforts of humanitarian organizations to advocate for this resolution and to ensure that they can help vulnerable populations. It's also critical that counterterrorism campaigns not be used as a pretext for member states to violate fundamental freedoms themselves. And it's concerning that some member states seek to undermine the advances on gender, civil society, and human rights made in Security Council resolutions and the global counterterrorism strategy. We've seen time and again that counterterrorism cannot succeed through sheer force and hard security measures alone. As I was reminded during my recent travels to Burkina Faso, Mali, Mauritania, and Niger, to be truly effective, as many have said, counterterrorism needs to be nested in a whole-of-government, whole-of-society effort. We have to nurture good governance, respect for human rights, access to education, healthcare, and economic opportunity. We have to support governments and their ability to deliver for their citizens. That is key to breaking the cycle of violent extremism. As I saw in Niger, we, the United States, can support security forces. That's important, and it's paramount for slowing terrorist activities, but it's not enough in a country where half of the students are not in school. As Nigerian President Bazoum himself says, this kind of lack of education is a driver of the next generation of insecurity and terrorism. We must ensure that women and girls have safe access to education, to healthcare, and to economic opportunity, and that their communities and their countries are more stable and more prosperous. That's why we are focused on implementing the current robust global counterterrorist framework focused on a whole-of-society approach. I also have to register the United States' deep concern over the untenable situation in northeast Syria, in the detention centers where the single largest group of terrorists anywhere in the world currently resides, and also the Al-Hol displaced persons camp with over 50,000 associated women and children. With approximately 10,000 foreign fighters in detention in northeast Syria, ISIS will seek to exploit regional instability to continue to pursue its Break the Walls campaign, freeing prisoners and replenishing its ranks. That's why we are working with all of you to spearhead an urgent effort to improve security coordination and encourage countries to repatriate, rehabilitate, reintegrate, and where appropriate, prosecute their nationals who participate in violent extremism. As part of this approach, our Department of Defense is working to construct a new all-purpose detention facility in neighboring Rum-Meilon that'll be managed by the Syrian Democratic Forces to securely and more humanely accommodate detainees. Finally, I would want to just note that I came from Washington yesterday evening, where we are hosting 49 African heads of state gathered for a U.S.-African Leaders Summit. Over the past few days, we've engaged in meaningful efforts to advance shared peace and security, spur economic growth, revitalize democracy, improve health infrastructure, and overcome global food and energy insecurity, and tackle the climate crisis, priorities that everyone around this table shares. But all of these shared goals are put at risk by the pervasive threat of terrorism. And the inverse is also true. If we can make progress against these goals, we drain the swamp where terrorism lives and thrives. So as we look collectively to overcome the cumulative destabilizing impact of COVID, climate shocks, armed conflict, including Russia's brutal war on Ukraine, we cannot afford to fail here. Next year, the General Assembly will review the global counterterrorism strategy, and we urge the international community to unite to address the scourge of terrorism, because, as Mrs. Anjali has reminded us in painful detail, the consequences of failure must not be acceptable to any of us. Thank you.
I thank Her Excellency, Ms. Newland, for her statement. I now give the floor to His Excellency, Lord Tariq Ahmad of Wimbledon, Minister of State at the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, and the Prime Minister's Special Representative for Preventing Sexual Violence in Conflict of United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland.
Thank you, Mr. President. Before I go any further, may I join on others and express the deepest condolences to my dear friend Simon Coveney and all the people of Ireland at the tragic loss of a peacekeeper in Lebanon, someone who was doing their job, and indeed in extending our prayers and best wishes for the recovery of those injured. Once again, I join with him in our strong solidarity for those who represent this organization on the world stage in some of the most difficult places in the world, and ultimately, as we've seen tragically, pay with their lives. We pay tribute to their bravery and courage, and our prayers and best wishes go for the quick recovery of those injured. Mr. President, may I firstly thank you. It's a great pleasure to join this Security Council meeting under your stewardship, and I pay tribute to India over its stewardship and contributions to this Security Council, particularly on this issue of counterterrorism during its tenure on the Security Council. And the government of India deserves immense credit for the focus they have brought on the issue of counterterrorism and also what lies beneath and what drives terrorism, which is a perverse ideology of counter and of extremism, and we need to work together to counter this. I join also in thanking our three briefers, Mr. Volonkov, who I know well. I'm sorry we're not seeing each other in person today, Mr. Chen, and of course the inspiring testimony, bravery and courage we heard from Anjali Vijay Kulta. Anjali ji, आपकी वराता और बहादुरी आतंकवादियों के खिलाफ के लिए हम सबका हमारी तरफ से बहुत-बहुत धन्यवाद. The meetings that India has led, particularly the excellent counterterrorism committee meetings in Mumbai and New Delhi, I was delighted that my dear friend, the Foreign Secretary, was able to join, and that set out our strong position of working together with India and indeed all international partners as we work together to counter the global threat of international terrorism. It is a threat, colleagues and friends, that is ever evolving. It is a threat that is becoming ever more complex, and it requires collective and comprehensive solutions and responses. Terrorist groups, including in Al-Qaeda, who operate today in Afghanistan and beyond, the Daesh affiliates, Boko Haram, Al-Shabaab, to name but two, who are continuing to work across different parts of the world and inflict human suffering to innocent lives, innocent people, destroying communities around the world. But we also need to recognize and be cognizant to the fact that these terrorist organizations are increasingly employing new methods of radicalization, the drivers of terrorism, and evolving tactics. They use innovative ways of technology. Even in the United Kingdom, we continue to face this challenge. Young minds being corrupted, the circumvention of the front door as technology is used as a tool to radicalize young men and women. And these evolving tactics require a response from ourselves as well to ensure that we counter this abhorrent ideology. We must also make effective use of our sanctions regimes to prevent terrorists from acquiring weapons and financing. We must adapt and evolve our own counter-terrorism efforts, prevent terrorist exploitation of emerging technologies, and indeed of vulnerable communities. Radicalization takes place through innovative technology means. We need to ensure we counter it through similar measures. And as we tackle terrorism, we must be vigilant and uphold three important principles. Firstly, we urge all colleagues, friends, member states to address the real drivers of terrorism and violent extremism using a whole-of-society approach. We must work with communities, with faith leaders, to address and eradicate the perverse ideologies which are used to drive these abhorrent crimes of terrorism. The United Kingdom is working with our partners to understand how the UN can better incorporate civil society perspectives into its work. Secondly, our policy and programming should understand and address the gender dynamics of terrorism. We know that terrorists and violent extremists are perpetrators of sexual violence. 2 weeks ago, I had the honor to host, on behalf of the United Kingdom, an international conference on preventing sexual violence in conflict and to strengthen our collective global response. I was honored to host, amongst others, Nobel Peace Laureate Nadia Murad and many other survivors of sexual violence who spoke about the need for governments to do more to end these atrocities. And there is also an important solution. In hearing Anjali ji today and her bravery and courage, we need to ensure those who survive, those who experience the scourge of terrorism, that we work with them hand in glove to ensure they inform our policies and what we can also do in working together to eradicate extremist ideology. We also, and I join with the Foreign Minister of Ireland, to call upon why is it in 2022 we are having this conversation of involving more women. It seems almost illogical that women today have to be subject to debates of conversation so they're involved in the main table, not in some side room to find solutions. We need to address this and address this now. We need to ensure member states everywhere involve women and take the lead in ensuring that they are very much pivotal to developing strategies to prevent and counter violent extremism and terrorism. Those strategies must address activity that specifically target women, indeed as potential perpetrators, victims, and influencers in their communities. And thirdly, I just wanted to touch on the importance of human rights in our responses. As the Security Council, we have an obligation under international law to protect and promote human rights. Therefore, states must act within the bounds of such law when countering terrorism. Otherwise, we undermine the very rights and freedoms that the UN was established to promote. To conclude, Mr. President, this Council has a vital and important role in tackling the scourge of terrorism, which tragically continues to destroy innocent lives around the world today. And to those lives lost as we remembered them at the start of this meeting, we owe it to act together and act now. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank His Excellency Lord Ahmad for his statement. I now give the floor to His Excellency Dr. Abraham Korir Singoe, Principal Secretary of Foreign Affairs of Kenya.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. At the very onset, I should like to convey Kenya's condolences to His Excellency Simon Coveney and to the Republic of Ireland on the unfortunate killing of their peacekeeper on mission in Lebanon. This underscores the need to work together to ensure the protection of all peacekeepers as they carry out their very critical mandate. I wish to congratulate Your Excellency, Dr. Jaishankar, for convening this important event. I commend India's stewardship of the Security Council Counterterrorism Committee for the last 12 months. The historic adoption of the Committee of the Delhi Declaration on Countering the Use of New Emerging Technologies for Terrorist Purposes this October reflects this leadership. I also thank Mr. Vladimir Voronkov and Mr. Shen Wegziongs for their briefings. Madam Anjali Vijay Kulte, your story as a survivor of terrorism is one of courage and resilience. You are an inspiration to many around the world who've suffered from these heinous acts. Mr. President, terrorism and violent extremism constitute grave threats to international peace and security. The bulk of the Security Council's counterterrorism measures are responses to the prominent targeting of member states by Al-Qaeda and its affiliates, the attacks of September the 11th, 2001 here in New York being a prime example. Unfortunately, despite the many countermeasures that have been instituted since then, this threat is persisting and even spreading dangerously. In several parts of Africa, terrorist groups with the support of foreign terrorist fighters and inspired by Al-Qaeda and Daesh ideologies are destabilizing and even holding governments at ransom. They're exploiting intercommunal tensions to increase their recruitment and radicalization and to intensify attacks across the continent. Mr. President, Kenya's counterterrorism is multi-agency and multi-sectoral. The lessons we've learned in building it may serve as useful examples to others. In the last 5 years, we've developed some of the most advanced disengagement and reintegration capabilities in the world. Operational decision-making is undertaken from the national to the local level and includes multiple security and non-security institutions. The intelligence, criminal justice, and administrative government structures work hand in hand. Every one of Kenya's 47 subnational counties has developed prevention strategies, and there are different stages of implementation. Equally, civil society is involved, reflecting the Kenyan people's commitment to this national priority to prevent and defeat terrorists. Over time, this has contributed to a marked reduction in the number of attacks and critically has blocked off any public legitimacy in any section of our citizenry for terrorist groups. With this example in mind and bearing in mind the need for a unified front to ensure effective and sustained counterterrorism, I wish to make 5 recommendations. First, counterterrorism against Al-Qaeda and ISIS groups should never cede ground to their extreme political demands and should offer no path to legitimacy. Too much counterterrorism is too kinetic and narrowly technical. It misses the essentially political, social, and even cultural dimensions of the threat. As such, counterterrorism measures that serve to to minimize the worst excesses of terrorists without being adequate enough to realize sustained victory are often deployed. The United Nations and states must add political, economic, and social tools to their counterterrorism efforts. They must also make it clear that terrorism will not offer a path to political legitimacy or power to terrorist groups or militants who employ this form of violence. Campaigns to negotiate with Al-Qaeda and ISIS-affiliated militant groups should differentiate between factions that are willing and able to renounce transnational terrorism and aims opposed to the United Nations Charter and its articulation in national constitutional and legal regimes. Second, counterterrorism must be linked to broader state and civil efforts to deal with its root causes. Political exclusion and marginalization, lack of economic opportunities, weak governance, persistent armed conflicts, and serious historical grievances create conditions for militancy that escalate into terrorism. In addition, the illegal exploitation of natural resources and natural resource conflicts, returning foreign fighters, particularly in populations dealing with climate change effects, are compounding agents. In short, fundamental changes in development and improved governance, reflected in inclusive and competent government, are requirements to overcoming the spread and entrenching of Al-Qaeda and ISIS groups. Third, the full weight of the Security Council's counterterrorism measures must be brought to bear in equal measure and without discrimination. Kenya has consistently called for the application of the Resolution 1267 sanction regime on all affiliates of Al-Qaeda, particularly Al-Shabaab. But few members of this council have resisted this petition, even as they unilaterally sanctioned the group for the reasons we seek its inclusion in UN sanctions. Last December, we negotiated for humanitarian carve-outs in Resolution 1267. We're glad to see that our aim then is being realized in a humanitarian carve-outs resolution. We hope these will clear the way for the listing of all groups that are formally and operationally linked to Al-Qaeda and ISIS. We agree with India that the de facto practice in the Security Council of classifying terrorists in inconsistent and opaque ways must be brought to an end if our counterterrorism efforts are to succeed. 4, at the technical level, cooperation for information sharing and capacity building is critical. We encourage enhanced collaboration at regional and global levels, including on capacity building initiatives by states who have advanced the prevention and countering of terrorism and violent extremism. We commend continued efforts of the United Nations counterterrorism entities in coordinating technical assistance and capacity building in support to member states in this respect. Fifth, in view of the current technological trends, we need to build partnerships on digital space and new technologies. Partnerships with internet providers and social media organizations can buttress the ability and efforts of national authorities to detect and disrupt online terrorism activities, including modes of terrorism, resource mobilization, and financing. We must also support states to develop measures and capabilities to regulate new technologies such as drones, virtual currencies, and counter the use of improvised explosive devices by terrorists. In conclusion, Mr. President, I reaffirm Kenya's unreserved commitment to the fight against terrorism in all its forms and manifestations. I thank you for your attention.
I thank His Excellency, Dr. Singoi, for his statement. I now give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Ramesses Klele, Permanent Secretary of Ghana.
Thank you. Mr. President, Your Excellency, the Minister of External Affairs of India, Ghana conveys deep condolences to India on the unfortunate loss of lives of peacekeepers while on a worthy cause for humanity. We are also grateful to the two briefers, Mr. Voronkov and Mr. Wenshong Cheng, for providing excellent context to our discussions. And finally, we commend Ms. Vijay Kulte on her bravery and courage to share her story with the international community. Mr. President, Ghana commends India's choice of the theme for this debate of the Council. I believe this discussion will engender a new sense of urgency among states and gave added impetus to existing efforts to address the menacing activities of terrorists. We thank Undersecretary General Vladimir Voronkov and the Acting Executive Director once again for setting the stage of what promises to be an open and frank discussion on a matter that must be at the top of the agenda of the Council. We acknowledge the efforts of the United Nations Office of Counterterrorism in assisting member states to implement the UN Global Counterterrorism Strategy and encourage the further collaboration of the UNODC with member states in the face of the rising threat of terrorism. Terrorism represents the most significant evolution of the threats to international peace and security that this Council is mandated to address. It represents a huge burden on our fragile society or security architecture as it converges with existing security threats to expose weaknesses in national, regional, and global mechanisms to protect our people. And it affects nations, regions, and our international community in profound ways, setting back our progress as a civilization. The urgency to act becomes pressing by the day as the emboldened terrorists now seek to gain access to maritime resources, more endowed territory, and highly urbanized and more developed terrain. The nature and gravity of the threat to international peace and security and to international commerce and investments needs no further elaboration. And it strikes at the heart of our efforts to achieve the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, as the attacks compound the developmental challenges facing communities worst affected by terrorism. In order to respond to the daunting challenges terrorism and violent extremism pose, our collective response must match the gravity of the threat to all our countries. The transnational character of terrorism provides justification for us to be global in our approach and coordinated in our actions. It is in this context that Ghana reaffirms her commitment to the global counterterrorism strategy and the implementation of all 4 pillars of the strategy in the ongoing war against international terrorism. We will continue to work with all member states in this regard. Mr. President, against that backdrop, I wish to highlight 4 key points. First, despite the continuing absence of a definition on terrorism, the international community cannot afford to be disunited in its actions to counter the threats that terrorist groups pose. We believe that to successfully detect, disrupt, and deter terrorist acts, there is a need for a shared view, common understanding, and equal commitment to existing and executing the counterterrorism frameworks, particularly through proactive national initiatives and improved international collaboration. Such a goal requires the Council and the wider international community to adopt a zero excuse and zero tolerance policy when it comes to the treatment of terrorist groups. There should be no differentiation between terrorist groups, as differential treatment would only undermine efforts to combat terrorism in a disproportionately affected by conflicts. They hold unique perspectives that may help improve the response to the underlying drivers of terrorism and violent extremism. Fourthly, terrorist groups engage in illicit trade in natural resources, raise revenue from illegal taxes imposed in territories they control, and use the dark web to raise and move funding. Our aim must be to dry up these sources of funding for their nefarious activities. To do so, countries affected by terrorists and their networks must be adequately supported with the funding needed to undertake operations to monitor the movement of money in and out of their borders and to regain control of the territories controlled by terrorists. Member states in the front line of terrorism accordingly require greater international solidarity, especially in these difficult times, when 3 years of multiple crises have diminished the capacity to counter terrorism. We equally encourage enhanced budgetary support for UNOCT and call for sustained funding for the implementation of the Global Counterterrorism Strategy. Mr. President, before concluding, let me share briefly some elements of Ghana's implementation of the strategy with a strong focus on prevention as the primary objective that needs to be pursued in addressing terrorism. Ghana has adopted a whole-of-society approach by involving the private sector and civil society organizations in addressing the underlying motivations for terrorism, while also taking a gender-sensitive approach to combating terrorism. This is helping to reduce the vulnerability of youth groups to radicalization and recruitment through the opening of further opportunities for them to fulfill their legitimate aspirations. We have also undertaken a wide array of measures for institutional development and to safeguard vulnerable communities, critical national infrastructure, mobility corridors, and public spaces and cyberspace corresponding to the second pillar of the strategy. Within the context of the third pillar of the Global Counterterrorism Strategy, we continue to cooperate with ECOWAS, the African Union, and the United Nations, and believe in strong partnerships for regional-led counter-insurgency operations, as well as cross-regional intelligence sharing to halt the cross-border collaboration by terrorist groups. In this regard, we urge sustained international support for regional mechanisms such as the Accra Initiative, which facilitates intelligence and information sharing on questions of terrorism, transnational organized crime, and violent extremism in relation to the expansionist agenda of terrorist groups from the Sahelian region. Finally, we believe in the complementary and mutually reinforcing nature of counterterrorism measures and the protection of human rights as envisaged by the fourth pillar. In our national strategy for prevention and suppression of terrorism, special attention has been placed on the protection of human rights, and any measures taken to combat terrorism fully comply with our national constitution, which has some of the highest standards of human rights, as well as with our obligations on international law, in particular, human rights law, refugee law, and international humanitarian law. Mr. President, let me conclude by reiterating Ghana's commitment to working with all member states in the efforts to prevent and eliminate terrorism in all its forms and manifestations. Although much work remains, our determination to overcome our differences is what would ultimately yield the desired outcomes. We therefore look forward to the discussions on the implementation of the counterterrorism strategy next year. I thank you for your attention.
I thank His Excellency, Mr. Cleland, for his remarks. I give the floor to the representative of Norway.
Thank you, President and Foreign Minister, for convening this important meeting. Let me also first extend my condolences to Ireland for the peacekeeper killed and those injured in yesterday's tragic attack in Lebanon. I would also like to thank the briefers today for their insightful and thought-provoking remarks and testimony. 2 decades ago, during Norway's previous term on this council, the September 11 attack shocked the world and triggered a profound shift in global security policy, one that recognized international terrorism as a global threat. Since then, the multilateral counterterrorism architecture has grown at a rapid pace and now forms a key part of the broader peace and security agenda. This, therefore, is an opportune moment to take stock of these efforts and consider both their strengths and deficiencies as we reflect on the way forward. President, there is no doubt that notable success has been achieved. Al-Qaeda is severely degraded and no longer capable of conducting complex attacks on the scale of 9/11. ISIL has been territorially defeated in its core area, and according to the latest Global Terrorism Index, global deaths from terrorism are nearly 60% below their peak in 2014. Yet, we have also witnessed more troubling trends emerging. Africa is now the continent most affected by terrorism. ISIL and Al-Qaeda affiliates have strategically exploited armed conflict, weak governance, and local grievances to radicalize and recruit. In many other parts of the world, right-wing extremism is on the rise, and new and emerging technologies are increasingly susceptible to misuse for terrorist purposes. Moreover, in some contexts, counter-terrorism measures have had grave implications of human rights. Over the past 2 decades, in the absence of an internationally agreed definition of terrorism, some governments have deployed counter-terrorism measures which violate a broad range of rights. And sometimes they are used to target political opposition, thereby shrinking civic space. Some counter-terrorism measures have also had unintended negative consequences for humanitarian action, affecting vulnerable people's access to much-needed humanitarian assistance and protection. The newly adopted Resolution 2664, however, can be an important tool to address this issue. In sum, we must acknowledge that the international community is up against a threat it cannot define, which has no clear success criteria, and which, in some contexts, is exploited to justify repressive measures. This is counterproductive to national and international efforts to combat terrorism. These challenges must be addressed. Allow me to underscore 3 points Norway considers crucial in guiding those collective efforts moving forward. First, our counterterrorism approach must be holistic and form part of a broader political strategy, one that is preventive, conflict-sensitive, gender-responsive, and regionally integrated. Addressing root causes through the promotion of the rule of law, sustainable development, and human rights is essential. Second, these efforts should be rooted in a whole-of-government and whole-of-society approach, which marshals cross-sectorial public resources, recognizes the importance of women's participation, and institutionalizes strategic engagement with civil society in the development and implementation of counterterrorism measures. Third, human rights must be respected at all times, including in the context of counterterrorism. On the multilateral level, all UN counterterrorism bodies should continue to mainstream human rights consideration across the work. For instance, CTED should further integrate human rights in its assessment activities and use the resulting data to inform its analytical products. In conclusion, President, Norway believes these principles are key to strengthening future counterterrorism efforts. If adhered to, it is our hope that in another 20 years, the issue will no longer be on our agenda. Thank you.
I thank Norway for their statement, and I now give the floor to France.
Madam President, I would like to begin by expressing the condolences of France to Ireland after the death of a blue helmet in Lebanon. I would like to thank India for having organized this debate. I'd also like to thank Under-Secretary General, the representative of the Executive Director of CTED, and Mr. Chen Weisheng and Madam Anjali for their briefings. Terrorism is spreading and it's becoming more diverse. Jihadism remains the most acute and the most murderous threat worldwide. Rather long from having disappeared, the threat of Al-Qaeda and Daesh continues to evolve. Present in the Sahel, these groups are spreading in the direction of the Gulf of Guinea to Central and Southern Africa, as well as in the Horn of Africa. In the Levant, the territorial defeat of Daesh should not mean that we let down our guard. The seizure of power by the Taliban and recent developments confirm the fears with regard to the possibility that once again these terrorist groups might find a safe haven in Afghanistan. The pandemic has also underscored the vulnerability of our societies in the face of new and emerging forms of terrorism, such as terrorism which is politically and ideologically motivated. This is taking place at a time of worsening security, illustrated by the return of war to the European continent. In the face of this, our means to fight this scourge must also evolve, and that's why the Counter-Terrorism Committee, with the support of the Counter-Terrorism Executive Directorate, this year has highlighted essential aspects, particularly during an important meeting organized last October in India. I am thinking of our ongoing efforts to counter the diversion of novel forms of financing in order to fund terrorism. Resolution 2462 made it possible to make certain progress. France now calls for a strengthening of international cooperation and the implementation of the recommendations of the Financial Action Task Force. We must also step up our fight against misuse of the internet. Prime Minister of New Zealand and President of France launched on the 15th of May the Christchurch appeal. An essential dialogue was begun, and the third summit was during the high-level week of the General Assembly, and this confirmed the commitment of states as well as private actors to counteract the circulation of terrorist propaganda on the internet. In order to be fully effective, our counter-terrorism efforts must be part of a global response, including development aid, strengthening of governance and the rule of law, and the fight against corruption. We must also respond to the fundamental challenge of climate change and the links between terrorism and trafficking in resources. More generally, with crimes that affect the environment. France continues to advocate for the establishment of a comprehensive and global approach which will get to grips with the root causes of terrorism in respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms. I thank you.
I thank France for their statement, and I now give the floor to Albania.
Thank you, Madam President, and let me join others in expressing our condolences and heartfelt sympathy to Ireland for the loss of a peacekeeper in Lebanon. He was working to implement a mandate adopted by this Council, and we owe him and everyone working on behalf of the UN infinite gratitude and respect. I thank USG Voronkov and Acting Director Chen for their valuable inputs, including the sobering and painful account from Ms. Kulti. Colleagues, we share the same assessment. Terrorism remains a serious threat to global peace and security, and we must respond effectively and decisively. Yesterday, we shared views about multilateralism and joint efforts to face and deal with common challenges. Countering and fighting terrorism is an area par excellence where, for all of us to succeed, we need to do so, plan and act jointly, continuously, and in a coordinated manner. Madam President, Albania has continuously and unequivocally condemned in the strongest possible terms any act of terrorism, no matter by whom or where committed. There is no justification whatsoever for terrorism or terrorist ideologies and activities. Terror represents an affront to all humanity and its values. Terrorist organizations such as Daesh and Al-Qaeda have been defeated, but they have not disappeared. They continue to gather financial resources to enhance their activities, including through the use of new technologies. Terrorism continues to thrive in armed conflict zones where rule of law institutions and human rights have broken down. It flourishes where poverty and hopelessness rule, especially among young people. Inequality, intercommunity conflicts, xenophobia, and injustice often serve as fertile ground for terrorist groups to grow. Madam President, increased activity of Daesh, Al-Shabaab, ISIL-K, Boko Haram, their ability to attack, to move, to fundraise and communicate transnationally, exploit new technologies to spread their hateful propaganda, brainwash new recruits, and stay ahead of counter-terror measures point to the troubling reality that our existing policies are not working as effectively as they should. It shows that repressive policies and forceful means alone are not enough. We are all aware of the growing impact of new technologies in every aspect of development and life. This makes cyber defense a priority matter of national security for everyone. Cyber is a tool used not only by criminals, but also by terrorists, be them state or non-state actors. We experienced ourselves last July. Therefore, it is imperative that we keep it on top of multilateral counterterrorism agenda by working together to ensure appropriate responses fit for our times and the digital age. Madam President, prevention is critical in our common fight against terrorism. We need to win hearts and minds of people, of the young people in particular, before the terrorists do so. We need to put bespoke programs in place that address in a comprehensive and sustainable manner the manifold drivers of terrorism. Prevention requires good and transparent governance, development and rule of law, human rights, accountable institutions, healthcare, including new forms of outreach through educational programs. To this end, we believe that the role of civil society, including religious communities, is crucial. All preventive measures require time, energy, and a lot of resources, but in the long run, they are far more. Above all, they put people and victims of terrorism at the center of efforts. We must always be aware that repressive policies can also be used, unfortunately, to deny basic rights and exacerbate grievances and potential for added violence. We must always remember that successful counterterrorism and prevention of violent extremism efforts must be rooted in respect of human rights, including freedom of expression and the rule of law. Efforts to counter terrorism become counterproductive when used as a pretext to restrain freedom of religion or belief and other human rights and fundamental freedoms, when they target members of minorities, when they are used for repressive surveillance or for coercive population control. Such measures have little, if anything, to do with counterterrorism. They are human rights violations and abuses. Madam President, we believe in close cooperation as a necessity to finding good solutions. This is why Albania has 16 regional international agreements on border management, exchange of data, and mutual support. Through prevention, close cooperation and coordination, we will be better equipped to deal with this and other collective challenges. And we highly value the support by the UNOCT to member states in developing comprehensive assistance plans to better support victims of terrorism. The unity of the Council on the nature of the threat and the means to deal with it is vital for our collective success, as it has been demonstrated with the landmark unanimous adoption of Resolution 1267. This spirit should continue and prevail, not become victim of narrow interests that prevent the Council to discharge its responsibilities. Madam President, we must never forget that war begins in the minds of men, and it is precisely there we need to work, also when developing a comprehensive strategy to defend terrorism and enable people to lead normal lives in peace and dignity. We must spare no effort to prevent the direct and indirect incitement to terror acts, any glorification of violence or criminals, to stand strongly against hate speech and discrimination while staying true to our tenet that terrorism cannot and should not be associated with any religion, nationality, civilization, or ethnic group. For us, there is no doubt. It is through continued collective action that we will be able to successfully fight terrorism in all its forms and manifestations and wherever it occurs. I thank you.
I thank Albania for their statement, and I now give the floor to China.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, I join my other colleagues in expressing our condolences over the death of an Irish peacekeeper and injuries to 3 others in Lebanon yesterday. I express our condolences to the bereaved families and the Government of Ireland. I welcome His Excellency Foreign Minister Dr. Jan Shankar presiding over today's meeting. I've listened attentively to the briefings by USG Voronkov, Acting Executive Director Chen Weixiong, and Civil Society Representative Ms. Koite. I wish to take this opportunity to thank the UN Office of Counterterrorism and the Counterterrorism Committee Executive Directorate for their important contributions to the global counterterrorism endeavor. Combating terrorism is the shared responsibility of the international community and a major duty of the Security Council. Thanks to the years of efforts, progress has been made in international counterterrorism cooperation, yet the situation is still grave and much remains to be done. Hence, the need for continued efforts by the international community. As we speak, global terrorist activities are resurging even faster, with terrorist groups such as Daesh, Al-Qaeda, and the East Turkestan Islamic movement running amok. Recently, ISIL-K attacked a hotel in Kabul, Afghanistan, causing casualties. China strongly condemns this attack and supports Afghanistan in combating all forms of terrorism and violence. This terrorist attack is yet another stark reminder that terrorism is the public enemy of humanity, and the international community must step up coordination and cooperation to effectively combat terrorists and do everything possible to prevent the spread of terrorist forces. I wish to underscore the following 3 points. First, further consolidate the political will on counterterrorism cooperation and maximize synergy. Terrorism is a global challenge. The prevalence of this phenomenon, the complexity of organizational networks, the frequent movements of terrorists, and its extremely deleterious effects are beyond the capacity for any country to tackle on its own. All countries should be aware that we are a community of shared security. It is our common interest to comprehensively, accurately, and steadfastly implement all counterterrorism resolutions of the General Assembly and the Security Council and crack down on all terrorist organizations, individuals listed by the Council. Certain countries backpedaled on terrorism issues in recent years. China finds this deeply regrettable. Politicizing and instrumentalizing counterterrorism issues and pursuing double standards or selective approach will ultimately harm oneself as well as others and undermine overall global counterterrorism cooperation. In the face of the common threat of terrorism, all parties should abandon geopolitical calculation and ideological bias. Earnestly step up practical counterterrorism cooperation in the judicial and other fields, support UN's central coordinating role, and expedite the negotiations of the Comprehensive Convention on International Terrorism. Second, further optimize resource allocation with a greater focus on the regions of the highest priority and the most pressing issues in counterterrorism cooperation. In recent years, the direct terrorist threats faced by developed countries have decreased, leading to a relative decline in investments in counterterrorism cooperation and thus a shortfall of counterterrorism resources globally. Africa, the Middle East, Central Asia, among other regions, are at the forefront of the global counterterrorism efforts. These regions face the most direct terrorist threats and suffer the most serious terrorist attacks. Therefore, their needs for upgraded counterterrorism capabilities are the most urgent. The UN and the international community should, in light of these needs, appropriately increase resource allocation to help developing countries strengthen their counter-terror capabilities, capacity building at the legislative, judicial, and law enforcement levels. Counter-terrorism situation varies from one region to another, which calls for contextualized and targeted measures to prevent terrorists from abusing the internet and new and emerging technologies to incite, plan, and carry out terrorist acts, or to recruit and finance. We should take seriously the threats posed by the backflow of foreign terrorist fighters and make proper repatriation and resettlement plans for those terrorist fighters stranded in foreign countries. Efforts should be made to effectively block the diverse channels of terrorist financing and take a multi-pronged approach to sever the ties between terrorism and organized crimes. Third, continue to address both the symptoms and root causes of terrorism and strive to eradicate terrorism at its source. Military means alone can hardly achieve this. We must give equal emphasis to tackling both the symptoms and root causes. and harness political, economic, judicial, and other means to respond holistically. It is essential to pursue political solutions to hotspot issues, help countries concerned improve their humanitarian situation, and prevent terrorist forces from feeding on instability. Underdevelopment is one root driver of terrorist forces' inception and growth. While resolutely fighting all terrorists, countries should give due regard to economic recovery, poverty eradication, education, and employment, pursue sustainable development pathways tailored to their own national conditions so as to minimize the living space of extremist ideologies and gradually eliminate the breeding ground of terrorism. At present, the global development course is suffering setbacks. Developing countries urgently need more international support. The international community should place the development agenda front and center, increase development assistance, and help countries concerned root out terrorism through development. Madam President, China always attaches great importance to and has been actively engaged in international counterterrorism cooperation in recent years through the China UN Peace and Development Fund. We've supported the projects of UNOCT and other agencies, and by conducting trainings, providing equipment, and holding cross-border counterterrorism seminars, helped countries in Africa and Central Asia prevent and combat terrorism. Chinese President Xi Jinping put forward the Global Security Initiative and the Global Development Initiative, advocating a common, comprehensive, cooperative, and sustainable security concept at the service of the implementation of the 2030 Agenda. This is of major practical significance to deepening international counter-terror cooperation, eliminating the root causes of terrorism, and maintaining common security and development. China stands ready to work with all parties to implement these two major initiatives and make new contributions to international counter-terror endeavor. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank China for their statement, and I now give the floor to the Russian Federation.
Madam President, please allow me to, first of all, express our condolences to the delegation of Ireland following the death of an Irish peacekeeper in Lebanon. Madam President, we thank the Indian delegation for convening the meeting today on such a relevant topic, and we express our support to all of the victims of terrorism through Ms. Kulte. We thank Mr. Voronkov and Mr. Wei-Xiong Chen for their detailed analysis of the threats and the overview of the situation in countering terrorism as a whole. We are grateful to the United Nations Office of Counterterrorism and the Counterterrorism Executive Directorate for their efforts in countering terrorism. The work of these bodies, their striving to react to current trends, gives us hope that the existing international counterterrorism architecture will continue being capable of tackling the new and emerging threats and challenges. The coordinating role of the UN, the principle of the primary responsibility of impacted states, and the respect for their sovereignty, their national characteristics and priorities are the fundamental conditions on which international cooperation should be built. Let me recall here that the counter-terrorism mechanism within the UN, first and foremost in the Security Council, already developed. It's up to member states whose task is to implement the commitments they undertook. It is only this way that we will come closer to the desired outcome, namely lowering the threat of terrorism. And of course, in order to be successful here, some will have to display strong political will, and some will have to reject the policy of double standards. Eradicating the phenomenon of terrorism is impossible until such time and for as long as terrorists are being used for geopolitical purposes and are being separated into good, bad, and not too bad terrorists. And unfortunately, we have many examples of this being done. And we have seen this approach ourselves when we were conducting our counterterrorism operation in our territory in 1990s, as well as during the period of fighting ISIL in Syria. Terrorist International found sponsors for themselves. They were being trained in third countries. They were being supplied from there with money and weapons, and then they were provided shelter there, and they were granted the status of political refugees. There were even more outrageous cases where hardened terrorist organizations, an attempt was made to present them as opposition members or humanitarians. But the outcome of this was the same then and now. Criminals remain criminals, and when they're endorsed and have the freedom of maneuver, they continue moving forward with their terrorist ideology. They continue organizing and perpetrating terrorist attacks, and sometimes even turn their weapons against their forefathers, even as was the case with Al-Qaeda and ISIL. The evil always returns like a boomerang, and when it does happen, then an international coalition needs to be formed to combat it. Madam President, in November, we had the Secretary General report on the issue of terrorist attacks based on xenophobia, racism, and other forms of intolerance, or in the name of religion or belief. We would like to, in this regard, draw attention to one important detail. The report shows there is a regional nature to such attacks. They are localized in the countries of Western and Eastern Europe, North America, Australia, and Oceania. Therefore, there is reason to think about certain trends which are characteristics for these very regions. We still have to determine what the root causes for this phenomena in the Western society is, why it came into being there and is progressing so rapidly. There are also questions that we have also which regard the conceptual approaches to countering terrorism. This has to do in particular to singling out some sort of violent extremism. This seemingly harmless wordplay can lead to serious consequences as it takes us away from combating terrorism, breaks our focus, and devalues our joint efforts here, whereas the terrorists themselves are taken out away from the international prosecution mechanism. Madam President, we are witnessing attempts to pack Security Council documents on counterterrorism with human rights dimensions, including the gender dimension. We are left with the impression that catching statements here are made for the sake of making such a statement or to shift the focus away from one's own unsavory record. Many of those who championed human rights in counterterrorism to date have not done anything to investigate the horrific instances of torture, abuse, and extrajudicial killings of those people who were accused of terrorism or were under investigation in the prisons in Afghanistan, Iraq, or at other countries where special secret jails were located. Do we know anything about those who have been found guilty on these cases? Have there been proceedings at all? Who was brought to account under these proceedings? Could our colleagues tell us anything at all about the functioning of the prison in Guantanamo? That is a very striking example of human rights violations in countering terrorism. By the way, it's been now 10 years that promises are made to close it down. Unfortunately, these promises remain empty. And this shows that ever new wording is proposed on human rights, but these countries think that they can only be addressed to anyone but themselves. Madam President, in conclusion, I would like to thank India, who has paid so much attention to the issue of bringing together the efforts of international community to counter terrorism during their Council presidency. Unfortunately, the threat of terrorism is changing very quickly. It takes on new forms. It adapts to its needs the most advanced technologies. We are convinced that counter it can only be done if we act together while strictly adhering to the norms and principles of international law, including the UN Charter, where the UN plays a central and coordinating role, and we pay due regard to the primary responsibility of states in countering terrorism. I thank you.
I thank Russia for their statement, and I now give the floor to Mexico.
Señora
Madam President, allow me to express the condolences of my country to the delegation of Ireland on the death of your countrymen as they were discharging their duties. We would like to thank the Under-Secretary General, Voronkov, and Acting Executive Director of CTED, Mr. Chen, for their briefings. And we would in particular like to thank the brave testimony of Anjali Vijay Kulte. We welcome the fact that India has convened this meeting, which is addressing one of the most urgent and delicate issues that we all face, because there's no doubt that terrorism is a threat for everyone. Mexico is convinced of the importance of having a preventive approach in order to address the threat presented by international terrorism, and it needs to be more effective than it has been up until now, with an emphasis on sustainable development and the implementation of the 2030 Agenda. As we have reiterated on numerous occasions, the real fight against terrorism has to be done through development, the creation of opportunities, employment, education, improving living conditions, the guarantee of the full enjoyment of human rights and gender equality. On this point, Mexico believes that it's important to include the impact of the notions of masculinity in our strategy to prevent terrorism, as has been recognized in the report of the Secretary General of the 26th of July past. Counter-terrorism efforts also require full adherence to the rule of law and an unrestricted respect for international law, in particular international humanitarian law and international human rights law. We are concerned that legitimate defense continues to be invoked in order to use force against non-state actors in a third country, according to the so-called doctrine of unwilling and unable doctrine. We reiterate that these interpretations go beyond what is set out in Article 51 of the Charter. We also continue to be concerned at expressions of discrimination and violence that emanate from intolerance and xenophobia, and that's why here we'd like to once again stress the importance of limiting the spread of hate speech. Likewise, we need to comply with the restrictions on the access to small arms and light weapons, as well as the need to strengthen efforts to prevent, combat, and eliminate their illicit trafficking. These arms, as we very well know, are very often used in acts of terrorism. All of this should go hand in hand with coordinated activities to strengthen national justice systems and the forces of law and order in order to punish, according to the law, those responsible for criminal acts and in full adherence to the norms of due process. Following this logic, it is up to the General Assembly to channel efforts to prevent and combat terrorism. If we do not address the root causes, then mere sanctions and the use of force will only encourage cycles of violence and will have limited effect in terms of beneficial effects. One serious problem is the absence of an internationally agreed definition of terrorism, which contributes to the shrinking of the limits within which counter-terrorism actions can be taken, and this is to the detriment of the respect for international law. the negotiation of a general convention on international terrorism, which would provide legal certainty to this phenomenon and put an end to unilateral designations, should be a priority. It is a priority issue. Finally, we welcome the adoption last week, of course, of Resolution 2664, which for the first time establishes a humanitarian exemption for all sanctions regimes. Given the great impact that counter-terrorism operations emanating from this Council have had on humanitarian organizations, particularly in the light of sanctions established pursuant to Resolution 1267, Mexico has stated on countless occasions the importance of having these safeguards available. We trust that this resolution will contribute to guaranteeing the delivery of humanitarian assistance to those parts of the world which need it most, and that it will protect humanitarian personnel, particularly medical personnel, who will not run the risk of being criminalized for simply fulfilling their mandate. Thank you very much, President.
I thank Mexico for their statement, and I now give the floor to Brazil.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, I would like to join other speakers in conveying to the people and the government of Ireland our very deep condolences on the loss of a peacekeeper in Lebanon yesterday. As a UN peacekeeper, he is one of our own, and it is fitting that we all mourn his passing. Madam President, I am honored to participate in this briefing under your presidency. I would like to congratulate India for its successful tenure in the Security Council and for its efforts in building consensus on the presidential statement we are going to adopt today. I would also like to thank Mr. Voronkov, Mr. Chen, and Ms. Kulte for their informative briefings. Brazil welcomes the topic chosen for this debate and would like to share some of the principles that guide our approach to counter-terrorism. Madam President, the repudiation of terrorism is a principle enshrined in Brazil's constitution. We strongly condemn terrorism in all its forms and manifestations and reiterate that there is no justification for terrorist acts. The lack of an internationally agreed upon definition of terrorism weakens our ability to cope with the phenomenon. It affects the cohesion of global efforts to address terrorism and could lead to the application of double standards. It is imperative that we overcome the stalemate at the Sixth Committee and work towards the adoption of a comprehensive convention on international terrorism. The importance of upholding legality must guide any response to this phenomenon. Counter-terrorism has to be fully compliant with international law, including the UN Charter and its rules pertaining to the prohibition to use force, international human rights law, international humanitarian law, and international refugee law. This entails guaranteeing respect for the freedom of association and expression and the right to privacy, providing attention to victims, enforcing standards for due process in the designation of terrorist individuals and entities, and designing sanctions regimes that do not affect vulnerable populations, worsen food crises, or hinder neutral, impartial, and independent humanitarian assistance. In this respect, I would like to express our recognition to the efforts of Ireland and the United States in coordinating efforts to ensure, through Resolution 2664, a horizontal humanitarian carve-out, which is an undeniable step forward. As this Council has already recognized, the nature and scope of possible linkages between terrorism and transnational organized crime vary considerably, depending on the geographic, social, and political context. There are no automatic linkages between these two phenomena. They demand different remedies and must be addressed in their respective fora. Madam President, prevention should be central to any counterterrorism strategy. This includes tackling its root causes, which are often linked to social, economic, and political exclusion, food insecurity, inequality, xenophobia, and other human rights violations. Therefore, promoting sustainable development on an equitable basis, as well as the rule of law and access to justice, is important to address the conditions that lead to terrorism and violent extremism conducive to terrorism. It is also essential to work towards the elimination of discrimination and stigmatization based on nationality, religion, gender, or ethnicity. We must not forget, finally, that the persistence of protracted conflicts and regional tensions contributes to creating fertile ground for terrorist actions. National law enforcement and strong judicial institutions are also key to an effective counterterrorism strategy. We must enhance international cooperation and technical assistance with a view to strengthen national capabilities to face terrorist threats. The United Nations is pivotal in facilitating this cooperation, and we commend the important role played by the United Nations Global Counterterrorism Coordination Compact entities. We also acknowledge the decisive contribution of regional and sub-regional organizations in building local capacities to fight terrorism. Madam President, as reflected in the recently approved Delhi Declaration, although new and emerging technologies may be misused to increase the reach of terrorism, they can also strengthen our ability to prevent and combat it. Their potential to foster economic opportunities and job creation can also contribute to addressing some of the root causes of terrorism. Finally, the development of counterterrorism strategies has to be inclusive. We must encourage the participation of women, civil society organizations, academia, and the private sector. We must also pay special attention to the needs of children and vulnerable populations if we want to step up our capacity to address terrorism in all its diversity of causes, manifestations, and effects. Let me conclude, Madam President, by mentioning that next semester, the United Nations will have an opportunity to improve its most important framework document regarding the fight against terrorism. The United Nations Global Counterterrorism Strategy emanates from its most representative body, the General Assembly, and thus encompasses a wider range of views and needs. Brazil is ready for a constructive engagement with member states with a view to achieving ambitious results during the upcoming discussions. I thank you, Madam President. Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Brazil for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Gabon.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to convey my condolences to Ireland following the demise of an Irish peacekeeper who fell in the line of duty in Lebanon. I would like to congratulate for your moving testimony. Mr. President, terrorist networks are constantly changing and they demonstrate how resilient they are, and this is despite the fact that the international community is mobilizing. Terrorist threats are intensifying and in magnitude and geography, and they spread to all regions of the world. governments are increasingly under pressure from people which are frustrated by growing insecurity, all the more so since the political and economic measures undertaken seem to be below the level of urgency and strength needed to combat this scourge. This is a combat which is severely testing the limited capacity of countries and which is destabilizing entire regions. Between January and September this year, 1,093 terrorist attacks were perpetrated in Africa, resulting in 7,816 deaths and 1,772 wounded. According to the figures coming out from the African Center on Terrorism Research, each of the 5 regions of the African continent had their own share of victims among the civilians, security forces, or government officials. This cross-border threat is formidable, and no government nor organization can fight it alone. A coordinated action, coordinated nationally, regionally, and global, is therefore key. Our work has to also be determined, multidimensional, and based on the principle of multilateralism. African leaders understood that very well. On the 28th of May 2022, heads of states and governments of the African Union met in Malabo and adopted an important declaration which reaffirms their determination to combat terrorism in all its forms and manifestation, as well as violent extremism on the continent. This declaration strengthens the many regional initiatives to combat terrorism. Mr. President, my country welcomes the measures undertaken within the binding normative framework we have on combating international terrorism and the measures aimed at making international cooperation even closer. But we need to do more. We need to especially make sure that the current polarization of the world does not weaken multilateralism, because terrorist groups and their affiliates could benefit from that and would be dangerous. We needed to especially underscore the need for a holistic approach which would fully take into account the precarious socioeconomic situations, which means that disabused young people become easy targets for radicalization and recruitment by terrorist organizations. In the face of this scourge, we need to agree on a certain number of fundamental principles. In particular, first, zero tolerance towards any forms and manifestations of terrorism and violent extremism. Secondly, our work needs to be anchored in strict compliance with international law, respect for the rule of law, and international instruments and relevant protocols. And thirdly, we need to protect our action from any form of politicization by being impartial beyond reproach. Fourthly, we need to be talking about a justification for terrorism. It is not used by poor governance, but is used to destabilize governance effort in developing countries, and it fuels the societal fragilities and cracks. We need to continue and consolidate our cooperation through sharing information, training of our security and intelligence personnel, and when there is a need, through supporting to operations against terrorist groups, in particular along common borders where very frequently government authority is limited. On our continent, the Accra Initiative aims at a consistent approach which brings together a military approach with a long-term efforts to rectify governance challenges, and this is a benchmark approach. Mr. President, we need to adopt our response and to do it consistently, because the fragmentation of our responses fuels the interest of terrorist groups. They exploit systemic cracks in order to sow violence. And among these cracks, we can name the pandemic of COVID-19, the humanitarian crises which become increasingly complicated with the effect of climate change having to do with growing poverty and inherent inequalities inherent to political and socioeconomic crisis. Our collective work against terrorism therefore requires that we have a global approach and a proper tackling of economic challenges of countries, in particular the education and training of the young people, strengthening the authority of our governments, in particular in fragile states, improving the living conditions for our people and amongst the disadvantaged. We also need to close the sources of funding for terrorist networks through consolidated partnerships in such areas as information exchange and monetary transactions online, illicit exploitation of natural resources by combating against the traffic of small arms and light weapons, combating human trafficking and kidnapping for ransom perpetrated by terrorist groups. Mr. President, the United Nations has to redouble its efforts, increase their means of action, and to use them firmly so as to support the initiatives and peace operations, in particular the African ones. We have to have a united front against terrorism, and the commitment of one and all should be complete at all times. We need to maintain our mobilization to adopt an international convention against international terrorism. If we are to have this will be a very tangible manifestation that our states unanimously condemn, and our peoples as well, of any terrorist threat in all of its forms and manifestations. In this regard, it's important that we constantly review the current sanctions regimes to make sure that they're best adapted to the changing terrorist threats, in particular through better targeting of terrorist perpetrators and their backers. In this exercise, which is of fundamental importance, we need to make sure that the rule of law is upheld and that we minimize the inadvertent and potentially collateral effects of sanctions on communities which could be unfairly affected. For Gabon, the efforts made by the international community have to be based on the regional and sub-regional organizations who better know the trends on the ground. But they can only be effective if they have the real capacities for their work. We, therefore, should provide these organizations with the tools they need to strengthen their capacities for resilience. And I need to underscore here the interaction between peace, security, and development, and the need to have a holistic approach to combat the root causes of terrorism. To conclude, I would like to underscore the crucial nature of our fight against terrorism. It is an absolute and a must key for peace, security, and development of states. The international community should be more determined to take urgent measures commensurate with the threat, and to do it within a framework of broader governance involving the whole of society. This will deprive terrorists of their ideological propaganda, which they use to radicalize and manipulate the vulnerable communities. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Gabon for his statement. Excellencies, the Council has before it the text of a statement by the President on behalf of the Council on the subject of today's meeting. I thank the Council members for the valuable contributions to this statement. In accordance with the understanding reached among the members of the Council, I shall take it that the members of the Security Council agreed to the statement, which will be issued as a document of the Security Council under the symbol S/PRST/2022/7. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. The meeting is adjourned.